The last 24 hours are becoming extremely interesting in the evolution of the Ukraine conflict and in terms of the overall changes which are now with growing speed taking place in the world. Let's begin with yet another speech that the Russian President Vladimir Putin has given, this time to the leadership of the Russian Foreign Ministry. Now, these meetings between Putin and the leadership of the Foreign Ministry happen relatively rarely. When they do, they are significant events. I can remember that one took place in the early autumn of 2021. That was the last one which took place. Putin at that point floated the idea of getting the Western powers to agree to pull back their forces from Russia's borders. He talked about the need for Russia to achieve security, long-term security, on its western borders. And that speech was then followed up with the two draft treaties that the Russians proposed in December 2021. And it is now clear that that speech in the autumn of 2021, before the Foreign Ministry Board, set out the process which would inevitably eventually lead us to the conflict, the armed conflict that began in Ukraine in February 2022. So that was one very consequential meeting. The latest meeting, the meeting that took place yesterday, and which is apparently still underway, there's been constant discussions. Anyway, this latest meeting appears to be at least as consequential. Now, the first thing to say is that Putin has provided us for the first time with a clear outline, a clear public outline of how he wants the conflict in Ukraine to end, or what his proposals are for the conflict in Ukraine to end. Now, to be very clear, this is just Putin. It's a proposal. It's very much in line, I should say, with the various proposals that we've been hearing about in the past. It is, in effect, the same as Istanbul Plus. Anybody who has been listening to the programs on this channel will be aware of all of the ideas that Putin has set out here. But this is the first time that he himself has set them out in so much detail. And this is what he said. Now, I ought to say we have not yet got an official transcript of his words from the Kremlin itself, but this is what the various Russian Telegram channels are reporting him as having said. They've provided their own translations, and I've no doubt that these translations are accurate. So this is what he said about the conditions from a Russian perspective for an end of the war. And he said this: these conditions are very simple. Ukrainian troops must be completely withdrawn from the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that it is from the entire territory of these regions within their administrative borders, which existed at their time of their entry into Ukraine. So the boundaries are those which the Soviet authorities created all those decades ago. It means, for example, Zaporozhye city, one of the biggest cities, one of the biggest industrial cities in Ukraine. It also means Kherson city as well, and all of Kherson on the west bank of the Dnieper River. All of these territories must be returned to Ukraine. But there's more. As soon as Kiev declares must be returned to Russia, and Ukrainian troops must withdraw completely from these territories. And then he goes on to say this: as soon as Kiev declares that it is ready for such a decision, and begins the real withdrawal of troops from these regions, as well as officially notifies us about its abandonment of plans to join NATO, an order to cease fire and start negotiations will immediately follow from our side. We will do this immediately. Naturally, we will guarantee the safe and unimpeded withdrawal of Ukrainian troops and formations. Now, what he means is this: if the Ukrainians announce that they're going to withdraw their troops from Donetsk, whatever part of Lugansk region they still occupy, as well as the entirety of Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, plus start taking actual steps to begin that withdrawal, and notice that is squirreled in there, but also formally notify the Russians of Ukraine's abandonment of its idea to join NATO, then the Russians are prepared to cease fire and allow the Ukrainian troops to withdraw peacefully from these territories. And then Putin goes on to say this: the essence of our proposal is not a temporary truce or a ceasefire, as the West wants, in order to restore losses, rearm the Kiev regime, and prepare it for a new offensive. I repeat, we are not talking about a freeze of the conflict, but about its final conclusion. And I will say once again, as soon as Kiev agrees to a similar course of events as is being proposed today, agrees to a complete withdrawal of its troops from the Donbass, Zaporozhye and Kherson region, and actually starts this process, we are ready to begin negotiations without postponing them. I repeat, our principal position is as follows: the neutral, non-aligned nuclear status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification, all the more so because these parameters were generally agreed upon by all in the course of the Istanbul talks in 2022. So those are Putin's terms. He says that the Ukrainians must withdraw completely from the four regions, except that those four regions are Russian. That is the implication here. Inform the Russians formally that there will be no NATO membership for Ukraine, and that Ukraine will revert to its neutral status, and also confirm that it is prepared to make concrete provisions, both for the protection of Russian speakers, for its own demilitarization, and for the liquidation on its territory of the groups and parties that embody what the Russians would say is the ideology of the 1930s. Then the Russians would be prepared to begin formal negotiations to iron out the details with the intention of achieving a full and complete settlement of Ukraine, of the conflict in Ukraine. But Putin also had more to say than this, because even as he's talking about a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, he is also, in effect, but not exactly, not precisely, linking this question to the question of the relations between Russia and the West. And he goes out of his way to say that this isn't really a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. He says that if that were the case, there is no doubt that Russians and Ukrainians, who share a common history, culture, spirit, and spiritual values, as well as millions of kinship and family ties, would have found a way to fairly settle any issues and disagreements between them. But this is not the case. The roots of the conflict are not in bilateral relations. The events in Ukraine are a direct result of the world and European developments of the late 20th and early 21st century. The aggressive, unceremonious, and absolutely adventurous policy that the West has been pursuing and has been pursuing all these years, long before the special military operation began. And elsewhere, he talks at great length about the history of, as the Russians feel, broken promises from the West, for example, about the non-extension of NATO eastwards and things like that. And Putin makes it very clear that this is the underlying cause of the conflict. And he therefore wants the conflict with the West to be resolved as well. And he believes that this must be done in the context of a reorganization of the security situation in Europe. And though he's not linking the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the end of that conflict, to this overall settlement of the situation between Russia and the West, it's also clear that he doesn't, in the end, believe that the situation on Russia's western borders will resolve itself fully until there is a final resolution of the conflict between Russia and the West. And what Putin is talking about is a negotiation, a settlement of the security situation across the entire Eurasian space. And that means countries like China, Iran, Turkey, probably India must be involved as well. The NATO powers, of course, will also participate, but it's quite obvious that in such a situation, such a overarching reformatting of the entire architecture, NATO itself would in effect become marginalized. So those are Putin's proposals. Now, as I've said, this is Istanbul Plus. He's been talking about this for a very long time. He's not spelled it out in quite this much detail, but we have it all set out there. And I'm fairly sure that in private discussions with anybody from the Ukrainian side or the Western side who wants to talk, Putin has spelled it out there too. The problem is that there is no conceivable way that the Western powers will ever agree to anything like this, nor will the current government in Ukraine do so either. And again, over the course of this speech that he made to the Russian Foreign Ministry Board, Putin made that very clear that he does not expect the current government of President Zelensky to agree to proposals of this kind. He once again went out of his way to say that Zelensky is exercising his powers illegitimately. He speaks about tricks that Zelensky and his entourage have resorted to in order to get round the fact that Zelensky now exercises power unconstitutionally without elections. He clearly does not regard Zelensky as an acceptable interlocutor in negotiations to achieve the sort of outcome that Putin wants. And in effect, he considers Zelensky to be an illegitimate usurper president who is not really the right president, the president with whom Russia ought to be negotiating. So the Russians do not believe that Zelensky will ever agree to this proposal, and the Russians almost certainly realize that the Western powers, at least whilst they're led by the leaders they have now, that they won't agree to these proposals either. And Putin made it absolutely crystal clear over the course of his address to the Foreign Ministry Board that though these proposals that he's laid out are real and, as far as he's concerned, reasonable, if the Western powers and the Ukrainians do not agree to them, then the war will continue and the Russians will continue to advance westwards until finally they achieve a complete victory and dictate terms which could conceivably end the existence of Ukraine. Now, that's not what Putin said, but I think that is the only logical meaning that one can draw from his words. Now, here is the tragedy of all of this. In my opinion, these terms that Putin is offering are entirely reasonable. He's completely correct in saying that this war has resulted as a result of a collapse of trust between the West and Russia, which has been building up for decades, that the Western powers willfully refused to take Russian security concerns seriously. They made, by the way, there's something he doesn't mention, endless attempts to destabilize and embarrass his government internally. They have, for decades now, been running personal campaigns focused to an inordinate extent on him, on Putin himself. And of course, despite the Russians making it absolutely clear many, many times, as the US's own ambassador, Bill Burns, reported to Washington in 2008, the Western powers have absolutely refused to recognize that for Russia, Ukraine's entry into NATO is an absolutely immovable red line. So Putin is right about all of these things. This conflict, whatever share of responsibility some may feel Russia bears for it, has at its core a complete failure of the Western powers to calibrate their foreign policy, their policy towards Russia sensibly, despite the fact that all sorts of Western officials with experience of dealing with the Russians had warned against the error of that policy. I'm talking about people like George Kennan, Paul Nitzer, Jack Matlock, all sorts of others. One can come up with William Perry. One can come up with all sorts of names for all sorts of people in the United States, especially prominent people in the United States, especially, who advised clearly and repeatedly that the Western policy, the American policy of pushing NATO eastwards in disregard of promises given to the Russians at the end of the Cold War, would sooner or later end in a smash. So Putin is absolutely right about that. So Western policy has played a major role. I would myself say overwhelmingly the predominant role in authoring this catastrophe. But it also goes beyond this, because the tragedy also lies in the fact that Putin's proposals, as he has now set them out, are reasonable ones. Now, if we're talking about Donbass, I don't think there's any serious doubt any longer that Donbass, the people in Donbass, by this point, think of themselves entirely as Russians. There has not been any resistance from within the territories of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic to the process of their integration with Russia. There's been hardly any resistance to the Russians on the part of the local people in Zaporozhye or Kherson either, both predominantly Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine. The same has been true, by the way, of Crimea. So if we talk about the local people, they either strongly support union with Russia, which is, I am sure, true in Donbass, or they're probably not too fussed about it. In fact, given that Russia is so much richer than Ukraine, they're probably happy to go along with it also. Now, if one reads, as I often do, you know, the sort of little comments that sometimes one finds squirreled in to Western articles about this region, articles by Western reporters who visited this region, often in the company of Ukrainian troops, one finds that there also. One finds complaints from Ukrainian soldiers expressed to Western journalists in various places where the Russians have come, that they have the support of at least part of the local people. So, accepting that Crimea and the 4 regions will be incorporated into Russia, something, by the way, which, in my opinion, the West could accept without recognizing de jure. That's what they did during the Soviet era with the Baltic states. Well, I don't think that is going to upset too many people on the ground in these regions. They will either welcome it or they will accept it. In addition, loss of these 4 regions is not critical for the long-term survival of Ukraine. Donbass is was Ukraine's major industrial region. The Sea of Azov was economically important. Mariupol was a major steel center. But ultimately, and in the end, a Ukrainian state can survive without these regions. It would probably, inevitably, start tilting eastwards again, but there would be a Ukrainian state. And there is no fundamental reason why the NATO, which has been unable to defend Ukraine from Russia, why NATO could not survive an agreement of this sort, why NATO should not be able to continue. Nothing about this proposal affects Western core interests, and certainly not American core interests, which, as a number of American commentators have pointed out, really have no reason to be concerned about who it is, Russia or Ukraine, that administers Donetsk city or Lugansk or Melitopol or Zaporozhye or any one of these places. Putin, by the way, went out of his way to say again over the course of this speech that his proposals are about Ukraine and that the entire conflict as it stands is about Ukraine, and that the Russians have no wider ambitions to march west into Europe to conquer fresh territories there. As he put it, that is all nonsense, which self-evidently it is. So the West could come to terms with the Russians over this. Certainly, it would be a big win for Russia. It would be a big win for Putin. But it would not compromise in any fundamental way Western security or US power. What it would do, as I said, is it would preserve Ukraine, and it would preserve tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives, lives which are being lost in a war which is being lost and which will continue to be lost if these proposals are rejected. And here we come to the major part of the tragedy, because just as Zelensky himself is never going to agree to these proposals, nor will the Western powers, at least not whilst they are led by the people who lead them now. The Western powers have committed themselves to victory over Russia in Ukraine. They have made every conceivable attempt to try to achieve that victory without involving themselves directly in the conflict. They've provided Ukraine with weapon after advanced weapon that they said they would not give to Ukraine, but they've gone ahead and done it. They've given Ukraine artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, HIMARS systems. They've given Ukraine drone technology. They've given Ukraine electronic warfare technology. They've helped Ukraine with intelligence and data gathering and data processing. They've given Ukraine tanks and armored vehicles. They've given Ukraine Storm Shadow and Scalp and ATACMS missiles. They've given Ukraine the entire toolkit of Western weapons. They're soon going to be giving Ukraine F-16 fighter jets, even though they themselves agree, Western officials agree, that the F-16s are not going to change the trajectory of the war. They have also now apparently been admissions in the Western media, I haven't seen the admissions myself, that the Ukrainian pilots who are expected to fly these F-16s are only minimally trained. So the West has given Ukraine everything it can, and it has failed to defeat Russia. On the contrary, Russia is becoming militarily stronger. The West has done everything it possibly can to undermine and destroy the Russian economy. The French finance minister, back in February 2022, straightforwardly said that the objective was to destroy Russia's economy. Instead, the Russian economy has grown stronger. It has grown. Growth has accelerated. We've seen more sanctions imposed over the last couple of hours on Russia. I discussed them briefly yesterday. The attempt by the West, the United States, to sanction Moscow's exchange to prevent conversions of dollars and euros at the exchange into rubles, something which has led the Russians to cancel all dealings in dollars and euros on the Moscow exchange. As many Russian officials are saying, and Russian commentators are saying, it will be a blip. Most of Russia's trade now is conducted outside the dollar and the euro system. The Russians by now have long since worked out workarounds, all of these sorts of sanctions. And as several Russian officials are now busy pointing out, in the long term, these latest sanctions are going to accelerate still further Russian economic growth, because whatever problems they cause, they might cause some trouble in Russian exports, but whatever problems they're going to cause in the short term, in the medium to long term, whilst these sanctions remain in effect, capital flight from Russia to the West becomes impossible. Russian business people and even middle-class people who once liked to put away some of their money into Western accounts, in Western banks, situated in Western jurisdictions, and to buy property, holiday cottages, even much bigger houses and those kind of things in the West. Those people can no longer do that. They're now obliged, whether they like it or not, and increasingly many of them, by the way, like it, they're obliged to keep their money in Russia, where, of course, it is accelerating, it is intensifying the ongoing investment boom which is taking place there, which is what is now driving the growth in the Russian economy overall. Anyway, the West has tried every single device to defeat the Russians in Ukraine. That was the project. If you all remember, I've discussed this many times, Mr. Wes Mitchell, way back in August 2021 in the National Interest, talked about some kind of elaborate plan to goad the Russians into a conflict in Ukraine and defeat them there, leading to presumably the collapse of the Russian government that then existed and its replacement with a government friendly to the United States, which would then subordinate its foreign policy to the United States and enter into a de facto alliance with the United States against China. Well, all of those plans have turned to dust. And yet, despite that, despite the total failure of the West's policies, the policies continue, as we've seen with the latest sanctions. And they're even escalating further, as we see with the way people have been dancing around the idea of allowing, or indeed undertaking, deep strikes with missiles, long-range missiles, far inside Russian territory, for all I know, attacking Russian strategic assets, and in the case of the French president, with all his wild talk of deploying NATO troops to Russia. So the West seems to have no ability to get off this escalator that it has created for itself, despite the fact that the proposals that Putin is making are reasonable ones, which, as I say, would not in the end affect NATO security or US power. Instead, we're going to get more of the same. I've been reading the media in the West this morning, in Britain this morning. There's barely any coverage of Putin's speech at all, to the extent that Putin's words have even been noticed. My impression is that they are being read as a sign of weakness, as Putin pleading for negotiations, even though that is manifestly not the case. So these proposals, which could form the basis for a historic compromise between Russia and the West, are not even going to be entertained. Instead, the best that the West can come up with is this freeze idea. Freeze everything on the front lines, pretend that this can be done indefinitely, rearm Ukraine, look forward to the day when Russia will collapse or Putin will fall or die or something like that, and then move to reoccupy these territories, the eastern territories that Ukraine has lost, all over again, and to humiliate and defeat the Russians. That is the only proposal that so-called Western peace advocates have been making. And in most cases, so far as I can tell, the only reason they are making these proposals at all are firstly because they sense that the war in Ukraine is being lost and they're worried about the geopolitical consequences of that, but also and mostly because they worry that the war in Ukraine, a bottomless pit in terms of the demands it's making on Western resources, is draining Western power, even as the United States wants to start focusing on the challenge from China in the Pacific instead. So instead of negotiations on these terms. We have proposals for the freeze, which Putin has again categorically rejected in these comments that I just read. And if the freeze can't be achieved, well, the only remaining thing is further escalation. Escalation with the cross-border shelling of Russian territories, the eventual plan, which I've no idea some people are mulling over in the West, to allow deep strikes with ATACMS and Storm Shadow and other missiles deep inside Russia against Russian strategic facilities. The plan to base F-16 fighter jets in Romania and have them take off from there and engage the Russians. A willingness to do all of these incredibly dangerous things, things which, in these comments again, the comments that he's just made, Putin, well, he didn't identify these ideas specifically, but he spoke about the fact that we are at a pivotal moment and that the dangers of an uncontrolled escalation, of a descent into the apocalypse, are growing all the time because the West seems to have no idea of how to stop. Well, there we are. We've been offered a way out. It's not a way that any Western leader would have chosen had they been given a choice. But it's a way which we have been led to as a result of disastrous mistakes that Western leaders have repeatedly made. The backing of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the insistence that Ukraine has a right to join NATO, and the disastrous invitation that was extended to Ukraine at the Budapest summit or was it the Bucharest summit in 2008. The sabotaging of the Minsk agreement after the support of the Maidan uprising and seizure of power in 2014. The fairly straightforward attempts to rearm Ukraine with a view to assisting Ukraine to achieve a military victory over Russia. All of this has led us to this point, but still, what we are being offered, though it is far worse than what the West, and by the way, Ukraine, might have had. We could have had a Ukraine keeping Crimea and Donbass if there had been no Maidan events, just saying. We could have had the Minsk agreement, which would have caused Donbass to rejoin Ukraine. We could have had all of that. But now, we're not going to have any of that. And we're still going to have a situation where, at the very least, Ukraine is also going to lose important cities like Zaporozhye and Kherson if these proposals are implemented. But to repeat again, these proposals do at least provide for the survival of a Ukrainian state, and they do not affect Western security and US power. And yet, just as we have chosen in the West, at every fork in the road, the wrong turn, we're going to do so again. I predict that no Western government, now or in the future, is going to look at these proposals seriously. So the war in Ukraine is going to go on, and the Russians will eventually win. And it's quite likely, based on what the hardliners like Dmitry Medvedev in Russia are now saying that there will be no Ukraine at the other end of this process, and tens of thousands more people are going to die, and a trail of devastation is going to be caused, and Russian military power is going to come in full force onto the borders of Eastern Europe. That is, if we're lucky, and something far worse doesn't instead happen. Well, anyway, it's all been set out. Let it never be said the choices did not exist. Choices in this conflict have always existed, and they have always been thrown away, and they have always been lost. Let's turn to the situation now on the battlefronts, because these are also now evolving in an increasingly dramatic way. And I'm going to start now with the latest report from Group of Forces North in Volchansk. And we read this. On 12th June, the Group of Forces North continued the liberation of border areas in Kharkiv region. This is, of course, from Severny Veter, Group of Forces North's Telegram channel, translated, by the way, by Slavyangrad. And it goes on to say this: in the Volchansk direction, fierce fighting continues in Volchansk. Assault groups of Group of Forces North have captured another building on the territory of the aggregate plant and continue their assault. The enemy activated in the area of multi-story buildings, that's the high-rise buildings, the area known as the Citadel, made 3 breakthrough attempts in the south and southwestern directions with a total of up to 90 people. As a result, they lost more than 50 men killed. This is not dead and wounded, it's killed. And, 50 men killed and wounded, and had no success. The east of the city is relatively quiet. The Ukrainians are saving forces for new counterattacks. Our TOS-1 machines are working on the places where they are concentrated. The total direction of Russian troops in the Volchansk direction was up to 100 meters. And then Group of Forces North goes on to say, the successes of Group of Forces North in the area of the aggregate plant force the fighters of the 71st Jaeger Brigade in the area of high-rise buildings, that's the Citadel, to make desperate attempts to push back the units of Group of Forces North to withdraw their main forces. If the Ukrainians lose the entire territory of the aggregate plant and their attempts to push our units back in the east of the city are unsuccessful, the men of the 71st Brigade in the area of the high-rise buildings, the Citadel in other words, risk becoming completely surrounded. And then they go on to say, the Ukrainian 57th Mechanized Brigade has suffered heavy losses and has been withdrawn to make up its losses. To replace it, the 3rd Brigade of Ukraine's National Guard was transfers and occupies the positions of the 57th Brigade. This is the 3rd Brigade of the Ukrainian military, not counting individual battalions, to lose combat effectiveness in the battles with Group of Forces North. So what Group of Forces North are telling us is that the Russians have not fully captured the territory of the aggregate plant, as well the mapping project, the Ukrainian mapping project, I shall henceforth refer to as DP, were claiming yesterday. But The Russians are now very close to achieving that. And that has left Ukrainian troops in the area of the citadel, to the north of the aggregate plant, all but completely surrounded, in effect trapped, that in order to break out of this trap, the Ukrainian troops in the citadel area tried to escape by crossing the Russian lines to escape southwards, but that they were stopped by the Russian forces and thrown back, and that all Ukrainian attempts to break through to these men in the high-rise buildings from the east have been repelled, and that in the process an entire brigade of the Ukrainian army has been in effect destroyed and has had to be withdrawn from the battlefronts in order that it can be reconstituted. And a group of forces north say that this is the 3rd brigade of the Ukrainian army that has been in effect destroyed in the fighting in Kharkiv region ever since the operation began, the Russian operation began in Kharkiv region back in May. Now, the Russians also provide us with a brief update of the situation in the Lipsy area. For completeness, I will cover it. They say that in the Lipsy area, the enemy again tried to attack Russian positions without success. Enemy losses amounted to more than 10 soldiers. In the area west of the settlement of Zelenoye, the advance of Russian assault units continues. But it's clear that the big battle is happening for Volchansk, and the Ukrainians are losing it, and more of their men are becoming surrounded. So, I've been saying for about a week now, that it seemed to me that Ukrainian troops north of the Volcha River were in effect surrounded. We now have formal confirmation of this, further confirmation from this, from the Russians themselves, the group of forces north. They've tightened the ring around the Ukrainian troops from the 71st Jaeger Brigade in the area of the high-rise buildings. And the Ukrainians, in their desperate attempts to try to break through, either to break out from the citadel area or to break through to establish supply lines to the Ukrainian troops in the citadel area, that the Ukrainians are suffering terrible losses, so that one brigade after another is being chewed up by the Russians and destroyed. Now, all of this was completely predictable. Why was it allowed to happen? Again, there was apparently a plan. We were told about this by the 79th Brigade, the force that's trying to defend Konstantinovka, west of Novomikhailovka, far away in the south. They actually said that there was originally a plan on the part of the Ukrainians to abandon Volchansk and Lipsy and to establish defense lines, to re-establish the defense lines closer to Kharkiv, which the Ukrainians had relied upon back in 2022. That it had been acknowledged at that time, that was in May, that Lipsy and Volchansk were ultimately undefendable, and that it would be too costly and indeed disastrous for Ukraine to try to defend them. And what we know is that Zelensky, apparently when he was told about this, apparently he threw an almighty tantrum. He started yelling at his generals. He again gave orders that there must be no retreat from any position. His people briefed the Western media that he thought that the generals were lying to him about the situation in Kharkiv. And so the Ukrainian troops received again irrational stand and fight orders in the case of Volchansk, which required the Ukrainian troops in Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, to hold their positions, thereby enabling the Russians to encircle them. And the Ukrainians have tried to break through, to try to relieve those encircled Ukrainian troops, but have suffered horrific casualties in unsuccessful attempts to do that, and eventually realizing that their situation was becoming desperate and that the prospect of relief from Ukrainian forces farther away would not come. It seems that the Ukrainian troops in this area of the high-rise buildings in Volchansk made, over the course of the last 24 hours, what looks like a desperate attempt to break out by effectively charging through the Russian lines, only to be defeated and thrown back with heavy losses. It's, again, difficult to understand how this can continue like this from week after week, month after month, and it's been going on like this all the way back to the start of the fighting in 2022. Zelensky, obviously backed in this by the Western powers, refuses to surrender territory. He will always come up with explanations as to why retreats cannot be entertained. He's been to the G7 summit meeting where he got his security agreement from the United States, more about that shortly, and promises of this $50 billion loan, more about that shortly as well. So he's been to the G7 summit. He's got the peace summit in Lucerne pending. That summit has now all but collapsed. Pakistan has now confirmed that it is not going to send representatives to the Lucerne summit. I'm increasingly unclear which countries, other than the core Western powers, are going to attend this summit. And of course, President Biden himself is skipping it. So Zelensky will always come up with rationalizations and excuses and reasons for trying to defend undefendable territory. And he has been wasting the blood of his army like water in order to hold these undefendable positions, so that we have now reached the point where Ukraine is reduced to enlisting young men and old men and perhaps even women in order to keep fighting, even as its army is exhausted and the soldiers are exhausted, and Ukrainian society is becoming increasingly war-weary and disaffected by his demands. Now, the Western powers must share a very large part of the responsibility for this. So their weapons that Zelensky and the Ukrainians are using to fight these battles, their staffs are there in Kiev providing advice to the Ukrainians about how to conduct this war. Their people on the ground are presumably giving the advice to the governments in Washington and London and Paris and Berlin, and to NATO headquarters in Brussels. There's no evidence that they have ever given Zelensky or the Ukrainians rational advice which might be logical in terms of Ukraine's overall military situation. Instead, Ukraine was pushed into two ill-conceived counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region in the autumn of 2022, which lost the Ukrainians many of their best troops. they were pushed into an absolutely disastrous counteroffensive last summer, which ended in catastrophic defeat. And one senses that in Kharkiv region, as part of this deal to provide Ukraine with permission to carry out cross-border strikes onto Russian territory, the Western powers insisted that Ukraine must hold its present positions and must, if anything, counterattack and try to push the Russians back. If a strategy had to be thought up that would cause Ukraine the highest possible level of losses and ensure its most complete defeat, then it seems to me that it's the strategy that the Western powers and President Zelensky and his officials have been following. Anyway, that's the situation in Kharkiv region. Everywhere else, the situation continues to go from bad to worse. Now, I gather that there's been a lot of important news coming from the Siversk area. The Russians, the 106th Airborne Guards Division of the Russian army, has now apparently entered the small village of Razdolovka, which it is currently storming. Razdolovka is at the southern spur of a long line of villages which could be seen as part of the wider Siversk conglomeration. That is actually helpful because the Russians, as it has now turned out, if they can occupy one village, can then move from village to village using the buildings of the village as cover, thereby limiting their losses, and that it's actually easier for them to advance towards a place like Siversk through villages, through built-up areas, rather than across fields where their forces can be observed and monitored and where the Ukrainians can attack them with FPV drones and bomb and shell them. So the Russians appear to be in the process of capturing Razdolovka. And there's also reports, by the way, I think I mentioned them in a recent program, that they've captured the waste heap or the chalk quarry or whatever you want to call it next to the village of Belogorovka in Lugansk region, and that they're now advancing towards Siversk from the east. And it looks like the battle for Siversk, the major battle of Siversk, which will probably lead to the fall of Siversk and the eventual fall of Liman, or recapture by the Russians of Liman, is perhaps a few days or weeks from beginning. We've heard less from Chasiv Yar recently. I think the Russians are still busy mopping up the micro-district east of the aqueduct. There's presumably some Ukrainian holdouts still in the small number of buildings in the west of the aqueduct, of the micro-district, but it's likely they will be pushed out from there too. Though, as I've said many times, it's not impossible that events in Chasiv Yar are moving faster than we know, because we can only work with news that is being reported, and in this war, an awful lot happens that is not being reported at all. But the biggest news, perhaps, arguably even bigger than the emerging disaster in Volchansk, is the huge disaster that is playing out for the Ukrainians in this massive battle that is underway in the fields and small villages west of Avdiivka and Ocheretino. Firstly, we've had Ukrainian drone footage of Novomikhailivka, and as far as I can see, the village is almost completely deserted, but it is clear that the Russians are in all but complete control of it. There was some suggestions that the Ukrainians still might hold a number of buildings in Novo-Alexandrovka, but based on the drone footage I saw, that looks unlikely. The Russians have not fully consolidated their position in Novo-Alexandrovka. They may occupy all the ground, but there are still Ukrainian drones flying overhead. The Ukrainians are presumably quite nearby. There's a picture in this film of a Russian soldier running along a road to try to get under cover as quickly as he could. That shows that the Russians do not feel that they can move around Novo-Alexandrovka safely during daylight. They have to take precautions. Probably they can only move about in armoured vehicles, and they move, no doubt, mostly at night. But they control the ground, they're consolidating, their forces will push beyond Novo-Alexandrovka and may already have done so, in which case, before long, the Russian Defense Ministry will confirm that Novo-Alexandrovka is now under full Russian control. But it seems that there are other villages in this area that are falling as well. So reports, and they appear to be confirmed by that Ukrainian mapping project, which, as I said, I will call DP. It appears that another village, another important village in this area, has also fallen, and that the Russians are now in control of a village called Novopokrovska, as well as the village of Sokol. Again, it's likely that the Russians don't fully control these villages, and that the Russians are about to attack the village of Novoselivka Persha, just to the west. Now, all of this may not sound dramatic, even though, as I said in my previous video, it does actually mean that the Russians are now approaching the main road between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, enabling them to attack the Ukrainians in Konstantinovka in the rear, even as the Ukrainians in Konstantinovka try to hold back the Russians who would be attacking them from Chasiv Yar, just saying. But the other thing to say is that it is clear that Ukrainian units in this area are being systematically destroyed, that they're being tracked by the Russians in the fields. There are every day now pictures, constant pictures of Western armoured vehicles, Bradleys, the occasional Abrams, being destroyed in the fields by the Russians. And one gets the sense that scattered over the fields and trying to hold positions in these small villages, the Ukrainian army in this absolutely critical area of the battlefronts is being taken systematically apart. Before long, there will be nothing left to defend places like Pokrovsk. I say that because it's clear that Ukraine is desperately short of reserves, and one really doesn't know how the Ukrainians are going to be able to plug this huge hole that has now appeared in their front lines, which is getting wider and wider and bigger. My own guess, by the way, is that this is the area which the Russians see as the Schwerpunkt, the place of decision. And that Council of War, which Putin held a few days ago with the frontal commanders, it's all about how to exploit this huge hole that has now been created in the Ukrainian lines. And of course, there's more news in other places. The Ukrainians do seem to have made an attempt to recapture the village of Novolskoye, north of Krasnogorovka. I was skeptical about that, but they do seem to have tried to recapture the village, and maybe they even did so. But reports are now coming through that as a result, And as a result of further Russian advances, not only are the Russians once again in full control of Nivolskoye, but another group of Ukrainian soldiers has been surrounded near Nivolskoye itself. There are reports as well that the Russians are now gradually, incrementally closing a ring around the remaining Ukrainian defenders in Krasnogorovka. Even Ukrainian mapping projects are now showing Russian advances in northern Krasnogorovka, which seem to be intended to link up with Russian troops advancing from along the western boundary of Krasnogorovka, which could leave a large number of Ukrainian troops in Krasnogorovka encircled. Once again, I remember hearing reports a while back that the garrison, the Ukrainian garrison in Krasnogorovka, under relentless pressure and heavily depleted, has been sending message after message to Kiev, pleading for permission to withdraw, only to have its requests ignored or refused. And now we see that the pincers are closing in around it. And, well, there's probably lots going on elsewhere on the battlefronts as well. But to add to all Ukraine's woe, there was another massive Russian missile strike last night, apparently targeting the great airbase at Starokonstantinov, where most expect the F-16s to be based. The last big Russian missile strike apparently targeted, amongst other things, a Ukrainian airbase at Mirovgrad. I presume that's close to Pokrovsk. And an S-300 system was destroyed there. This has been a terrible year for Ukraine's air defense systems. And, well, the Americans have now said that they can only provide one more Patriot missile system to Ukraine. They have no more to give. The Germans have just said the same. They can give Ukraine one more Patriot missile system and one more Iris-T system. But after that, their ability to keep supplying Ukraine with air defense systems is exhausted. And the Italians, strong-armed into sending another SAMP-T system, but they have only one more left, and they're not prepared to send that as well. And attempts to get the Argentinians to agree to part with some of their inoperable super étendard fighters. Well, it seems that even President Milei of Argentina has decided that this isn't a good plan, and he's apparently rejected it. So it's a terrible military situation. It makes the urgency of beginning negotiations even more obvious, at least to me. Putin, as I said, has provided an opening, but no one, of course, in the West appears to be interested in walking through it. Maybe the outcome of the forthcoming French elections will catapult into power in Paris people who might choose a different course. But of course, unless he chooses to resign, which by the way he might do, Macron will still be president, still in theoretical charge of foreign policy. We will probably see a conflict and paralysis in that case emerge in Paris between an anti-interventionist French parliament and a militantly interventionist president, but it's unlikely that the overall policy will change. And of course in Britain, both of the two big parties, both Labour and Conservative, the outgoing Conservative Party, remain committed to the same policy over Ukraine. The former British diplomat Ian Proud has, by the way, written another fine article on his blog about the absolute lack of debate about all of these questions in Britain. He points out that both parties, both Conservative and Labour, have committed themselves to increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, that this has been done completely without full discussion, notwithstanding the fact that Britain is in the midst of a budget crisis with debt to GDP level well above 100%, something which Britain has not experienced since, I believe, the 1960s. Notwithstanding that, as I said, this increase in defence spending has been nodded through. It's going to happen because both parties agree. And perhaps even more bitter, In Proud points out that this actually isn't going to change anything, because defence spending in Britain already amounts to 2.3% of GDP. But despite the fact that the share of GDP that is being committed to military spending has been actually growing, the condition of the British military is still deteriorating. And it's not difficult to understand why. In fact, he explains it very well. The point is that resources, as soon as they appear, are almost immediately transferred to Ukraine. And the cost of the new systems that the British military and the British government wants to acquire, which are, by the way, mostly big strategic systems, is spiraling out of control. It is growing much faster than the overall increase in defence spending. And of course, no one should be surprised about this. It's a point I have been making it programme after programme. Brian Beletic has been making it as well. If you do not have the big industrial infrastructure to support big rearmament programmes, then simply throwing more money at the problem is not going to result in more capability. It will only result in higher and higher cost. It's a simple rule of economics, and it is baffling that no one can see it. Meanwhile, after the preposterous $50 billion finance package to Ukraine, which the G7 has now signed off, which I discussed in my programme yesterday, and by the way, Alex and I at the Duran have done a whole video in which we discuss it and other things of a financial nature, which you can look out for. Anyway, on top of that, the United States and Ukraine are now going to agree to another security agreement. It's the one that the Financial Times told us was simply there to palliate the Ukrainians, to make them feel a little better, to make them feel that, yes, the United States really is behind them, that they can trust the United States, that the US isn't going to double-cross them and abandon them. So we get another piece of paper signed with pomp and formality in the presence of all the other G7 leaders, with Zelensky there in his trademark khaki outfit, signing it also. It's apparently all about arming and training Ukraine. It's not going to change Ukraine's fundamental situation in any way because, well, the United States has already been arming and training Ukraine. It's been doing so for years now, since before the conflict in 2022 began. And what good has that done for Ukraine up to this time? Hundreds of thousands of dead, devastated cities, broken economy, lost territories. But anyway, more of the same. It's not a long-term commitment to Ukraine. The United States is not promising to come to defend Ukraine as if Ukraine was a military ally, as would be the case under NATO if Ukraine were part of NATO, for example, for which, by the way, thank God, the United States is not promising to do that. This isn't even a treaty. It's just an agreement signed by one president with a Ukrainian president, which the next US president, it might be Donald Trump, it might be someone else, might decide one fine day that they don't want to continue with, in which case this agreement can simply be scrapped and it will find its place in the waste paper basket of history. This is apparently what the mighty West is reduced to. Gambling with Armageddon, as Putin is talking about, with all these dangerous ideas about deep strikes into Russia and deploying troops there, which, thank heavens, the European public has now made clear it doesn't support, and coming up with empty proposals conducted in meaningless ceremonies which change nothing and advance nothing. A real plan, a real way forward out of this mess, I do not see. In fact, if we go back to the security agreement, all that it will do is incentivize the Russians further to keep fighting in Ukraine. Because, of course, they will not want any part of this agreement to be put into effect. They will not want the United States rearming Ukraine or training the Ukrainian military. So, there we are. A proposal, an agreement that's going to make Ukraine's situation worse. A $50 billion loan, which Ukraine cannot repay, and which the Europeans are going to set themselves up as liable for. More Russian advances on the battlefield. Ukrainian troops likely trapped now in Volchansk, soon probably trapped in Krasnogorovka. The Ukrainian army collapsing, its center breaking. And Putin, for his own reasons, he's not doing this because he likes us, but because he sees it in Russia's interests to do that. He's offering us a way out, a face-saving way out that preserves our interests, but we won't take it. There's claims that I've seen circulating, and I don't know how true they are. I'm not very familiar with the history, that in 1916, during the First World War, there were proposals that came very, very close to general acceptance for an end to the First World War. That the parties, the various warring parties, understood that the war, that they'd all miscalculated in 1914, that the war was not being fought over anything fundamental, and that an agreement was basically on the table to end the war in 1916 and to go back to what I suppose would have been the status quo ante, the situation before the war began. I'm not going to pretend I'm very familiar with the history, this particular history, but I've been seeing all of these reports. And of course, this idea was rejected, and apparently instrumental in engineering that rejection was the British Minister of Armaments, David Lloyd George, who soon became the head of Britain's War Cabinet and Prime Minister. And of course, the American President, Woodrow Wilson, who was already scheming to get the United States into the war for various reasons which I don't pretend I fully understand. So the result was that the war continued, and the losses continued, and Germany collapsed, and Russia collapsed, and there was a Russian Revolution, and there was an economic and political crisis right through the 1920s and the 1930s, and a terrifying political movement gained power in Germany, and Communist state was established in Russia, and we ended up with a Second World War that was far more devastating still. All of that might have been avoided if there had been peace in 1916. Well, the events this time are perhaps not as dramatic as that. The war is on a far smaller scale, though it must be said again that the potential for things to go wrong are terrifying and beyond the imagination of anyone in 1916. But it seems that Western governments and Western leaders are going to make all over again the same mistake. Truly, history does not repeat itself, but once again it rhymes. Well, this is where I end my programme today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget also that you can check out our shop and get yourself the range of things that we have for Football 24. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.